No.
Is that the idea?
Yeah.
Uh,
So then we have to
This
press on
earlier
this.
on.
Welcome everyone. We will start our evening.
This is what we're pushing.
Let us start. It's 7:31, so we're already behind schedule. My name is Dina Zwijger. I will be the moderator today. Today's event was organized by the Leonard Wolter Stichting and Een Ander Joods Geluid, a different Jewish voice. The Leonard Wolter Stichting aims to promote the study and knowledge of the Arabic culture in the Netherlands. And it has a particular focus on the political and social history of the Palestinians and of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A Different Jewish Voice aims, among other things, at stimulating debate and critical discussion on Israel and Palestine. The two organizations often cooperate, and they annually try to organize a lecture such as today, together. A note about today's event, it is being recorded and it will be put on YouTube, so FYI. Today, we will have a lively discussion on the ways, motives, and tactics Israeli lobbies use to silence critical voices. So I'm going to explain a bit what you can expect for the coming 2 hours. First, the event will last 2 hours. We will have 3 rounds of talks. Each round is followed by a Q&A session. So the first round is with Peter Breinart, who is joining with us online. And he's the only one joining online, so luckily the rest is physically, but we're still very happy that he could join, all the way from the United States. This round will take the form of an interview, so I will interview him for 25 minutes, and then we will have 10 to 15 minutes questions that you can ask the speaker. We will have walking microphones, people walking with microphones, I should say. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait until the walking microphone comes to you. Also so that we can hear each other, but also for the recording. In the second round, I will give the floor to Elise Garcia, to the left of me, who will also have 25 minutes to discuss the topic, specifically focusing on silencing tactics in the Netherlands. And this will again be followed by 10 to 15 minutes a Q&A. And lastly, we will have Itai van der Wal and Laila Katterman, who will talk about their work on Israeli-Dutch academic ties. Again, 25 minutes, they will have the floor, and then we'll follow that by 15 minutes of questions that you can ask. As some of you might have noticed, we have some printed things for you there. There is an article written by the first speaker that you can take free of charge. And then we have also a report by the European Legal Support Center, where Alice works, that she will discuss today, and you can also take home with you. And please remember that we would like to encourage a critical discussion, but also respectful discussion, so we won't tolerate any racist, sexist, homophobic remarks or ad hominem attacks. Let's start. So, we'll start with our first speaker, Peter Breinart, who is professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York. He also writes a newsletter on Substack, and you can see the link, so if you want to read his stuff, look it up. Not now, wait. And people can sign up actually for the newsletter. So, Peter, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. So let me start actually with the beginning. Can you explain what we mean or what is meant with the term Israeli lobbies and why it is in the plural? Because I remember you insisted on the plurality of it. Can you explain a little bit about this term?
Sure. I should also maybe mention that I'm the editor-at-large of a publication called Jewish Currents that I would encourage people to check out, since it's an American publication that tries to engage with many of these questions from a progressive Jewish perspective. I'm obviously more familiar with the U.S. context than I am with the Dutch context, so you can you'll have to translate what I say into the Dutch context. But in the United States, one of the interesting things is that you have a series of different organizations, all of which I would say support the idea of essentially unconditional U.S. support for Israeli policy, virtually no matter what Israel does, and support Israeli impunity. But those organizations don't always get along with one another. And as odd as it may seem from a progressive perspective, they often sometimes are quite unhappy with one another for various different reasons. So for instance, some of the organizations that I think you could broadly call pro-Israel lobbies in the United States take a view on American domestic questions that is relatively progressive, and others don't. So for instance, some of those organizations lobby for unconditional support for Israel, but basically think correctly that Donald Trump is a grave threat to American democracy. Others are actually very happy with Donald Trump. So they have their own conflicts, and they have different strategies. So for instance, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is the largest and most powerful kind of pro-Israel lobby in the United States, is very dedicated to being bipartisan, essentially to trying to get the Democratic and the Republican Party to agree. There are other groups further to the right that actually think the Democratic Party is a lost cause and would like to kind of get on the Trump train towards a kind of an authoritarian American political system in which the Democrats can never hold power again. So these are some of the strategic differences that I think you find, even though, as a general rule, all these organizations basically support unconditional US support for the Israeli government.
Thank you. Yes, clear. So different strategies, different political orientations beyond Israel. So we've explained the term Israeli lobbies, but there's also been a lot of talk and a lot of events on the attempts of silencing different voices, especially critical voices voices critical of Israel. Can you also explain the term silencing, and maybe also basing it on personal examples that you might have faced and how you dealt with them?
Sure. I should first say that I am in an incredibly privileged position vis-a-vis compared to many other people. I'm a tenured professor at a university. I'm also Jewish myself. And I think I'm very actively involved in my own religious community. And I think for various reasons, I have a level of protection that many other people, particularly Palestinian Americans, do not have. The way I think that it's to understand the kind of most recent push around what I think you could call silencing, which has to do primarily with the notion that it is anti-Semitic to oppose political Zionism, which is to say anti-Semitic to oppose the idea of a state that privileges Jews over Palestinians, and also anti-Semitic to call for boycotting Israel. I think to understand this push, this kind of silencing, one has to understand the events of the last decade or so. I think the critical thing that's happened over the last decade is that it's become clearer and clearer to more and more people that the possibility of creating an independent, sovereign Palestinian state in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip is no longer possible. And so if you take as axiomatic that Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem deserve to be citizens of a country, that is in some ways the kind of most fundamental right that people have, and it becomes clear that it is no longer possible for them to be citizens of their own country, then one has to think about the idea of them having citizenship in the country in which they live, which is the country of Israel. Israel controls in different ways the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. So that naturally moves you towards a position of thinking about transforming Israel from a state that is built around what B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, has called Jewish supremacy, to a state that aspires towards equality under the law. And I think it's in recognition of that shift in progressive thinking, and it's a shift that's been led by many Palestinian intellectuals and activists, that pro-Israel organizations, whether they be AIPAC or others, have basically moved to assert the idea that being anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic. Because what that really means is that if you call for a state that is not a Jewish state, but in fact a state for all its citizens, a state that treats all of its citizens equally under the law, irrespective of their religion or ethnicity, if you say that that's anti-Semitic, that that's a bigoted position, then you force people to accept the status quo, right? If a Palestinian state is not possible, and you can't reconsider the notion of a state of Jewish privilege, then the only, ironically, or in a kind of Orwellian turn, the only non-bigoted position to take, the only non-anti-Semitic position to take is to accept the one state that exists today, right? Which is a state of Jewish supremacy in which some Palestinians inside the Green Line are second-class citizens, and many Palestinians beyond the Green Line are non-citizens. And I think it's in that context that we need to understand this effort to silence people by saying that calling for legal equality is an act of anti-Jewish bigotry.
Can you give us examples? Have you been silenced? And now I think like what you're arguing is that it actually changed because of this shift. Also, like more and more people are realizing that we are going through what they call the one-state solution. Do you see also a shift then from like 20 years ago in the debate around Palestine to how the debate shifted and the silencing attempts shifted along the shifting of the debate of the Palestinian state?
Yes, I'm not suggesting that nobody was called anti-Semitic, in the 1990s or certainly that happened as well. But I think if you look at things like the rise of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance of Anti-Semitism, which is and getting that adopted by various governments and various other entities inside the United States and around the world has been a major push for pro-Israel organizations around the world. I don't think it's coincidental that you see the emphasis on this definition at the same moment that the two-state solution dies. And this has very profound implications. I mean, it plays out differently again. And I should say that I am very, very lucky that I can speak my mind with very few repercussions. Absent maybe an angry email or tweet or something like this. But in what we see in the United States, for instance, is that laws that require people to sign a pledge saying that they will not boycott the state of Israel in order to work with state governments. There's a wonderful film that some of you may know about, which came out recently called Boycott, which kind of chronicles the impact of this. So you see, for instance, a Palestinian American a teacher who a speech pathologist in Texas, who, as a condition of her employment with the Texas public schools, which of course has nothing to do with Israel-Palestine whatsoever, right, has to play, and who has family who are suffering under Israeli domination, has to pledge to not boycott Israel in order to work in the Texas public schools. And so that's one example of the silencing. In Germany, where I was a couple of weeks ago, we see in Germany most cultural life requires on some state funding. And we found that you get cut off from state funding, not just for supporting boycotting Israel, but even for having an association with supporting boycott Israel. Say, let's say you ran a festival that included a speaker or an artist who supports boycotting Israel. So these are some of the kinds of silencing that I think we've seen.
Yeah. Thank you. And so as you said, you're mainly based in the US. You've also traveled recently to Germany, and you've already discussed a little bit the situation in Germany. And I think in the article that is printed here and that the public will take with them today, I think you very successfully show how, for example, in Germany, just saying the word Palestine can already be considered anti-Semitic, just lobbying for anything that has to do with Palestine. So I see what you say, that it's kind of like this automatic connection that's being made. Like if you lobby for the rights of Palestinians, you're automatically being anti-Semitic. But then my question is, indeed, like how are these silencing attempts being justified? And you already mentioned the IHRA definition, so maybe you can expand on that. But also, so what kinds of justifications do these Israeli lobbies use to say, we don't want this event to go on, you should not invent the speaker, and how they are so successful in pressuring also the people into abiding by their definition and justification?
I mean, I think you have a number of different arguments, none of which actually really, I think, hold much water if you actually think about them very much. So one of the arguments is every group of people around the world has their own state. And therefore, if you oppose the idea of a state for the Jews, a Jewish state, you are singling out Jews in a way that's bigoted towards Jews, right? But if one thinks about that for a few minutes, it stops really making any sense, right? First of all, there are many, many, many groups of people around the world that might want a state built around their own ethnic or religious identity. Catalans, Basques, Kashmiris, I mean, Punjabis, I mean, we could go on and on and on and on. Many, many, many such groups, many of which have been fighting for a long time, which don't actually have a state built around their own identity. And the reason for that is that the notion of ethnic nationalism is not the only vision of nationalism we have in the world. The other notion is the notion of civic nationalism built on the principle of equality under the law, right? So instead of saying that the Catalans should have their own state in Spain, you could say that Spanish citizenship should provide equality under the law to all people, Catalans included, right? There's something particularly perverse about saying that it's anti-Semitic to oppose a state that privileges Jews over Palestinians when the Jewish state as it exists today denies both Palestinian national rights and also Palestinian individual rights, since there are millions and millions of Palestinians who live as non-citizens without due process, without freedom of movement, without the right to vote for the government that controls their lives. And so it seems to me that I am perfectly fine with the notion, with a certain notion of Jewish national self-determination, just as I am a supporter of a certain notion of Palestinian self-determination. But self-determination does not mean sovereignty necessarily in a state that privileges you over your neighbor. What it can mean is a cultural autonomy, the right to practice your own language, to run schools in the language of the majority group in a particular community within a larger framework of legal equality. And legal equality is the key thing. And so I think this is one of the arguments that people make about why the idea of being against a Jewish state is anti-Semitic. And there's one more point. If you say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, what you have done essentially is turned all Palestinians into anti-Semites, right? Because, you know, this maybe some people, newsflash, most Palestinians, almost all Palestinians are anti-Zionists. Why would they not be? I mean, even if you are a Jew who believes that the Zionist movement did things that were very valuable for the Jewish people, it gave them a sense of security and a sense of a kind of home, and it's obvious that Zionism has had a very, very brutal and negative effect on Palestinian lives over many, many generations. So if you say that Palestinians are anti-Semites simply for opposing a Jewish movement that has had very, very dire consequences for them, you turn that entire population into bigots, which is a profoundly dehumanizing thing to do, and of course lays the groundwork for the complete silencing of Palestinian political voices. Because if all Palestinians are bigots, then of course we shouldn't have to listen to them. And I think this is the move that we see being made in Germany and in other places.
Yeah, and doesn't it also, like you say, equalizing anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism dehumanizes the Palestinians, but it also puts all Jewish people into this category. They must be Zionist, and I think there are enough self-identifying Jewish people who also self-identify as anti-Zionist. But I also feel like I also have had a lot of discussions with people, Jewish Israelis, who would find it very difficult to say. They might say I'm non-Zionist, but to go to the anti-Zionist, and it's exactly what you say, that they say, like, my grandparent, it was Zionism that saved him, or he felt that he could finally start a new life in this new land. So it is also a sentimental issue for many Israeli Jewish citizens, at least,
and Jews around the world. And also the term Zionist itself is a term that can take on very, very different meanings. So for instance, I myself would identify myself as a cultural non-state Zionist in the tradition of thinkers like Ahad Ha'am and later Judah Magnus and Martin Buber, who believed in the importance of a Jewish society in what Jews call the land of Israel, but did not believe in a state that privileged Jews over Palestinians. Actually, Buber believed in a binational state, as I do, right? So these terms need to be unpacked, and they can mean different things to different people. But I think you're right. It may be true that there are many Jews who feel sincerely that for them, Zionism or political Zionism, support for a Jewish state, is not a choice but an identity. They can say that, but they don't have the right to impose that identity on other Jews any more than, let's say, a Catholic who believed that it was inherent in being Catholic to oppose abortion and oppose LGBTQ rights, would have the right to say to another Catholic, mine is the only acceptable form of Catholic identity, right? The Jewish experience is vast. Our sacred texts are have many, many voices, and they can be interpreted in numerous ways. Just to give one small example, the Satmar Hasidim, who are the largest Hasidic group in the world, right, who have rallies outside in the New York area that are larger than AIPAC's annual meeting, remains profoundly anti-Zionist because of their reading of the Talmud, which they believe says that there should not be a Jewish state until Messianic times, right? So you're really going to go and say to those people that they're not real Jews? It makes no sense. I think it's only in some ways because if people had an understanding of the richness and the diversity, I think, of Jews' interpretation of our own history and our own text, they would understand how little sense this makes.
Yeah. Yes. So from listening to you, what I then see clearly more is that the problem is that maybe the one definition of Zionism kind of won over, which is a definition that also Israel employs, but also there's a specific definition of anti-Semitism now being employed, and those are overlapping. And we should indeed, like you say, look more into what do these terminologies mean to different people, and we cannot just like use it in a single way, which is now being done. Back to the silencing thing, though, because you said you're familiar with the context in the U.S. And the political context in the United States. You've talked a bit about Germany. How would you think that the location or the country, the context of different locations and countries impact silencing attempts and the work of Israeli lobbies?
Well, in many ways, there are different dynamics, right? So, for instance, one dynamic that makes the United States different, and I actually think makes it easier to criticize Israel in the United States and in other places, is that in many, many diaspora Jewish communities, which are mostly, every diaspora Jewish community is outside the United States is much smaller than the Americas. And very often in smaller Jewish communities, essentially you have something which functions as a Jewish community. You're either in it or out of it. And if you are a prominent critic of Israel, you are essentially outside of the Jewish community. You might be a Jewish person, but you are essentially outside of a community which is organized around a Zionist framework. That's very difficult. That's very painful for many people. One of the advantages we have in the United States, because of the larger Jewish population we have and the diversity, is that there are many, many different Jewish communities, and it is possible to find one that suits you, even if you are a strong critic of Israel. So that's one national difference. I think another national difference, of course, is the legacy of the Holocaust and the way it looms, it plays differently in different places. So to go back to Germany, of course, which is going to be one of the countries, of course, where it's going to loom the largest. I have the sense, and I'm not a German, that many Germans feel that the creation of a Jewish state and Germany's support for that Jewish state represents a form of atonement, a way of becoming a good German as opposed to the bad Germans of previous generations. And the way someone described it to me was almost that Israel even means that the whole story of the Holocaust for Germany has a kind of happy ending despite its horror, right? And if that's the way you see it, then having to then recognize that this happy ending, this Jewish state, this redemption for the Holocaust, is itself perpetuating terrible human rights abuses. Of course, not on the scale by any means of what the Nazis did, but terrible in and of themselves, actually complicates that whole narrative. And one notices that essentially that narrative is the Palestinians are entirely absent from that narrative. So what happens is the Palestinians come into this narrative, which is about Germans and Jews, right? German Gentiles and Jews, and they complement and they undermine it in a way that for Germans, I think is very something Germans don't want to deal with because they like the narrative as it is, right? And I think Germans are also understandably, profoundly, not all Germans, but most Germans don't want to be anti-Semites. And it's great that they don't want to be anti-Semites. But the danger is when the fear of not wanting to be called a bigot turns you into an accomplice to another form of bigotry, then you've actually subverted the entire moral purpose of what you were doing, right? Because fundamentally, the reason no one should want to be an anti-Semite, that no one should be an anti-Semite, is because no one should want to be a bigot, because no one should support oppression against any group of people. The Holocaust was not a horror because it was done in large measure to Jews. It was horror because it was done to human beings, a large group of whom were Jews. And it seems to me it's that universalistic framework, which I feel like in Germany, again, you would know much better than me about the Netherlands, has been lost to some degree. And so it creates this deep moral perversity in which you claim to be holding faith with the people who were murdered by the German regime during World War II. And in so doing, you actually desecrate the cause of human rights, which is the very moral underpinning to oppose a massive atrocity like the Holocaust.
So if we talk about the context, you mentioned indeed like the existence of a diverse community or not, that impacts the legacy of the Holocaust. What I'm left wondering is, does Palestinian activism or relationships between the country and the Palestinian leadership, whatever leadership, but does that also have an impact? Do the Palestinians impact debates on Palestine in European and Western countries? Or is it really totally, like, do they just not have any impact at all, would you say?
I think in the United States, Palestinian voices are having a much bigger impact, are having a bigger impact than they did before. I think their impact would be much bigger, except the fact that Palestinians face this barrage of constant attacks of anti-Semitism, and also which is mixed in with a very strong degree of Islamophobia in the United States since September 11th, and accusations of terrorism, all kinds of things that I think make it harder for Palestinian voices to break through. And yet, nonetheless, even though we do not have a figure in the United States of the prominence that Edward Said had before he died, there are a whole range of very talented Palestinian writers, activists, some also on TV, who I think, whose voices are being heard. And I think one of the things that you find on American college campuses, you know, if you listen to American Jewish organizations, they describe these college campuses as kind of hotbeds of anti-Semitism where Jewish students are continuously victimized simply for being Jewish or simply for having pro-Israel views. And there are Jewish students who have Zionist views, who do have uncomfortable experiences, and sometimes even experience anti-Semitism, yes. But what they don't say, which happens a lot on American college campuses, I think, is that there are interactions between Jewish and Palestinian students in which Jewish students grow up in communities where they have no access to Palestinians. Their synagogue, their community Jewish day school, their camps never expose them to Palestinian thinking. And when they actually are exposed to Palestinian thinking in the classroom, or just because they have a fellow student who talks to them about what their families have experienced, it actually has a quite profound impact. And one of the things that the American Jewish organizations don't often like to admit about Palestinian solidarity activism on American college campuses, for instance, is that Jews are deeply, deeply involved in it. It's, you know, so there are large numbers of young American Jews who have been, particularly because of the influence of learning and listening to Palestinians, who have actually taken up the cause of Palestinian solidarity. Now, my sense is in Germany, it may be, or in other parts of Europe, maybe even harder, because the pressure under which Palestinians labor may be even greater than in the United States. But I think in the United States, there is some cause for hope.
So again, yeah, so my next question was going to be what the impact is of silencing attempts. But I think you just mentioned that really the impact is that so many people who are working for Palestine and for Palestinian rights are finding it more difficult to have an impact, and actually often are bullied into being silent. So yes, so it does have grave impacts as well on the organization of these movements. One last question, just to end with advice from you, based on what you see, what you've written about, your personal experience. What advice would you give people who are dealing with silencing attempts and who have dealt with it? Like, what would their approach? What do you advise them to do, or which approach should they take?
Well, I guess I would say a couple things. I think I want to encourage people to really understand and even have empathy, although it's hard, maybe hard sometimes, for the set of fears that produce this kind of silencing. The Jewish traumas that I think are profound and deep and multi-generational, and which then get kind of weaponized by the Israeli government and by Israeli kind of pro-Israel organizations, which I think often use these in quite cynical ways, but they're building on things that are real, a genuine anxiety, fear about essentially a world without Jewish power, or a world without a state that's built on Jewish supremacy, right? And I think it's important to try to genuinely understand. One of the things I love about Said's writing, and of course Said was, you know, took a backseat to no one in his profound opposition to Zionism. And yet even through that, he was able to understand the set of historical experiences and fears and traumas that had led not all Jews, but a significant number of Jews to move towards embracing this particular movement and then the state that it produced. So I think on the one hand, I think it's important to try to hold that. And on the other hand, it's important to remember that we will all be judged in some way or another, whether you, like me, believe that you will be judged by God, or whether you believe in a more secular context that you'll be judged by your grandchildren or somebody else, or that we will all be judged based on our ability to show some degree of courage in fighting for human equality. for the basic notion that all human beings are created equal and they all have the right to equal measures of equality and dignity and freedom. And now people can express that basic imperative in many different ways. There are many issues beyond the struggle for Palestinian freedom. But if the struggle for Palestinian freedom speaks to you in particular, and you've decided that's where you want to plant your flag in struggling for a more just and decent world, then you have to do it with courage. And the courage means that you are going to be called ugly names, and you may face various repercussions. And I think it's important to remember, if you're in Germany or the Netherlands or the United States, that for Palestinians on the ground, in particular, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, let alone in Gaza, the courage that is required for them to struggle for freedom is much greater, because you may risk being slandered, you may even risk losing your job, you are much less likely to risk imprisonment or injury or death. And it seems to me if Palestinians can show, and some Israeli Jews in solidarity with them, can show that level of courage, then I think it's incumbent on those of us for whom it's much easier to try to show some courage as well.
One final question from me, and then maybe in one sentence. But what advice would you give people or organizations who are doing the silencing?
It's hard in a sentence. I would say, I know many such people and have my entire life. I guess I would say to them is they need to listen to Palestinians. They need to listen to Palestinians and start to see them Palestinians as human beings. Because the problem is that the dehumanization, the racism towards Palestinians is so profound that I think it is in many cases genuinely unconscious. And people don't even realize that they can't see Palestinians as human beings. But I actually have seen many examples in which a genuine interaction, when you actually take the time and show the humility to actually listen to Palestinians talking about their life and talking about their aspirations, that can start to chip away at this dehumanization and this profound anti-Palestinian racism, and ultimately can lead very unexpected people to have a kind of ideological transformation. And that kind of transformation gives me hope.
Thank you very much. Nice to end with a note of hope. So I asked my questions. I would now like to open the floor for the public here. If you have questions to our speaker, please raise your hand so our walking mic can walk towards you. Yes. Okay, one question. Yes.
Sorry, sir. Hi. Maybe it's beyond the scope of this discussion, but what I think is that fundamental Christian movements do have a bigger, maybe even a bigger impact on this whole anti-Semite discussion when you're talking about Palestinians than the Jewish community.
Thank you. Can you address that? Yeah.
Sure, I can only speak in the US context. I think if you look at the Republican Party in the United States, you see that the impact of conservative white evangelical Christians who are very, very pro-Israel is very, very profound. It's not as strong in the Democratic Party. And I think there are a range of reasons for this. One of them is a theological, a kind of a particular interpretation of Christian theology in which it's very important that this is Jewish land and that Jews create a state there because that allows a series of other things to happen theologically, not happy things, by the way. But I also think that when one looks at the right in the United States, what we might call white nationalists or white Christian nationalists, there's a strong identification with Israel because in some ways Israel represents a kind of model for what those people would like the United States to be, right? In the sense what they see in Israel as a country with clear legal hierarchies between different groups. And that is and an immigration policy that maintains one group as a clear demographic majority. That is what the Trump era Republican Party wants in the United States. They want clear legal hierarchies that make it clear that white Christian men have more rights than everybody else do. And they particularly focus on the question of immigration, but not only immigration. And so in that way, I think the struggle that is playing out in Israel-Palestine between a notion of Jewish supremacy and a notion of equality under the law is mirrored in the United States in which we also face a version of that, of kind of white Christian supremacy against equality under the law. And it's not surprising that the people who are fighting equality under the law and unfortunately having a lot of success, particularly this week in the United States, also admire the Israeli government that is successfully opposing equality under the law there.
Thank you. We have time for another question, and I see a hand in the back.
So you mentioned multi-generational, like the Jewish multi-generational trauma and the weaponization of the trauma. I was wondering whether you find the two correlated in a way, and whether, you know, the weaponization of the trauma sort of serves the Jewish pro-Israelis to legitimize what they're doing. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. It's a critical way of legitimizing. I mean, if you notice the way someone like Benjamin Netanyahu speaks, and also you look at the discourse of against a group like AIPAC, there's this constant invocation that essentially it is still 1938, and that there is some force, whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah or the Iranian government or the BDS movement, which is essentially represents an existential threat to Jewish survival. And I think that so that effort is continuous. I think that some people are more susceptible to it than others, given their own experience. Again, of course, everyone interprets their own experience differently, right? So one of the fascinating things, for instance, if you look at prominent children of Holocaust survivors, right, is that there are prominent children of Holocaust survivors and Holocaust survivors themselves who are very, very prominent right-wing supporters of the Israeli government. But some of the most prominent opponents of the Israeli government and most militant are also the children of Holocaust survivors. Amira Haas, for instance, the very heroic longtime Haaretz journalist, child of Holocaust survivors. Sarah Roy, who lived in Gaza for many years. I think that, again, it partly, I think, has to do with the story that was told within one's own family that was used to make sense of this particular experience, right? Because all experiences need interpretation, and the first interpretation takes place within the family. And so I think because of certain people's interpretation of Jewish suffering inside the family, that there may be more receptive to the story about Jewish suffering, which is told by the Israeli government and its allies. Whereas other people, particularly who tend to come from a left-wing background, may have been told, I think about someone like Amira Haas or Norman Finkelstein, they were told inside their own families a story about the Holocaust that primed them, I think, to take a universalistic perspective about the lessons of the Holocaust when they started becoming political actors in the broader world.
Thank you. We we don't have much time. We first have Itai here, Jaap, who mentioned, and then you will have the last question, but we really have a few minutes only. So Itai, first you.
Thanks.
Sorry.
I mean, thank you for your contributions, Peter. It was really wonderful to listen to. I have one quick question that's not at all big or anything, but at some point during your talk, you said, like, to some extent, Jewish traumas lead to silencing. But I think in the context of your discussion, there is a risk of privileging this interpersonal sphere of silencing, right? Mm. Where trauma speaks to trauma, or where on college campuses, like individuals will take action and silence, or even if you also focus a bit on families and how Jewish families like maybe form or pass on these traumas that then lead to silencing. And the feeling of safety. But I also wonder, how would you position this in relation to maybe another focus? Because if you ask me, like, the Christian Zionists have already been mentioned as a leading factor of silencing, but also I think Europe's and the Anglo-Saxon world's need, which is a racist and imperialist need, if you ask me, to have a nation state in the world that fits their worldview and where they can put Jews in that worldview. How does that would you say how is that involved in silencing as well? And also the need for a clean conscience, that I think we've discussed, but this might be like a more material context in which silencing should also be placed. How does that resonate with you?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there. It would take a longer conversation between the two of us, I think, to flesh it all out. But I would say, first of all, I didn't mean to suggest that because there is a genuine experience of Jewish trauma that gets passed down and that can be re-inflamed, that somehow that you should be able to use that trauma to make to silence anybody else, right? Or to deny anyone basic rights. Far from it. I mean, right, I would say that to any group. I mean, goodness knows, enormous numbers of Palestinians have extreme degrees of trauma, right? Much higher degrees of trauma if you live in a place like Gaza, right, than most Jews do today. And so we need to honor everybody's trauma, but also have as a general fundamental view, right, that I think that our basic view is that all people deserve equality, and that you don't get to, the fact that you experience some oppression in the past doesn't give you the right to deny, to then turn around and oppress others. I do agree with you that I think that one of the things that I think doesn't come through very well in the American media is the way in which the Christian support for the idea of the creation of the state, for a Jewish state, was often linked to a desire to have the Jews be somewhere else other than Europe, right? So Arthur Balfour, right, the author of the Balfour Declaration, is a hero to many Jews. I mean, I literally know people who were named after Arthur Balfour. But Arthur Balfour was a big anti-Semite. I mean, he supported the Aliens Act in 1905 in Britain that basically shut down Eastern European Jewish immigration. And he said explicitly that one of the reasons he wanted a Jewish state was he wanted Europe to have a place to deposit this Jewish problem somewhere else. And so I think it goes, I think, again, fundamentally to this question is, what is our understanding of what country should be? Is our understanding that every different group of people should have its own country in which they get to dominate whoever happens to be alongside them? Or do we aspire towards a vision in which people in multiple different countries, regardless of where they live, actually should have the right to be treated equally? And if one has a kind of ethno-nationalist vision of nationhood, it actually doesn't work out for diaspora Jews very well, right? And we find again and again that many of the leaders around the world who are most pro-Israel, whether it be Viktor Orban or various other far-right figures, or even Donald Trump, also actually are often quite hostile to the Jewish populations in the countries that they run.
Thank you. We have 1 minute for the last question and answer. So brief question and brief answer.
Sorry.
On BDS, how, I would like you to clarify how the Jewish American convince their supporters, the movement, how do they convince them that it is anti-Semitic? What argument do they give? How do they clarify to their supporters? Because it's the only non-violent movement that, so for me, I'm struggling with that. How do they convince their supporters that it is anti-Semitic? That's it.
Yes, let me try to be brief. First, just to be clear, I mean, again, Jews don't all believe the same things. There's a Jewish organization, Jewish Voices for Peace, which supports the BDS movement. If you listen to the people who oppose the BDS movement, they tend to say things along the lines of, well, the leaders of the BDS movement, like Omar Barghouti, don't want Israel to exist. And what the implication is that therefore that means that someone like Omar Barghouti wants to oppress or even kill the Jews of Israel. But actually, if you listen and read Omar Barghouti's writing, and I don't happen to agree with everything that Omar Barghouti says, but if you read his writing, clearly his vision is he wants a vision of legal equality. And so what's constantly done in this conversation is to elide the distinction between the idea that Israel as a Jewish state would be replaced by legal equality with the idea that Israel would be replaced by oppression or genocide, right? That's the constant move that's always being made. The other is that, well, BDS is anti-Semitic because why aren't they boycotting Myanmar, right? Or boycotting, again, these are not very particularly thoughtful arguments, right? The reason the BDS movement is not focused on Myanmar is because it's a Palestinian movement created by Palestinian civil society, right? Are we really supposed to expect that the Palestinians are going to create a movement to boycott Myanmar? The South Africans created a movement to boycott the government that was oppressing them, right? Again, honestly, these arguments are not particularly well thought out, but unfortunately, the voices that could counter them often are silenced and therefore are not able to engage with them as effectively as we might like.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for joining us. I understood that you will be leaving, but again, thanks for being with us for 45 minutes. Thanks.
I enjoyed it. My pleasure. Thank you.
So again, check out the link, read his things, and learn. Good. Let's move on to our second speaker. You can go there and take this with you. So we have Alice Garcia from the European Legal Support Center, who works as an advocacy and communications officer.
Thank you. Hold on. Can you hear me? Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dina. Thank you to the organizers of this very important panel and discussion. So the very topic of the conversation today, how does this work? Yes. Is one of the reasons why the European Legal Support Center, ELSC, was created. Because in the past 5 or 10 years, more and more people and organizations in Europe have been facing very serious limitations on their fundamental freedoms because of their support to Palestinian rights or because they demanded accountability for Israel's violations of international law. So that's why the ELSC was established in 2019 by the Palestinian network of NGOs, PINGO, and the Rights Forum in Amsterdam. So basically today, the ELSC is the only organization in Europe and the UK, including the UK, that supports and empower the Palestine solidarity movements through legal means. So the way we work, first we have a monitoring part of our work, so we document and analyze the incident of repression in Europe, and in 2021, we published our first monitoring report, the one that you can see printed here, on the attempts to chill Palestinian rights advocacy in the Netherlands. This is very high for me. So basically, then we have the defend pillar, where we provide legal support and assistance with a network of lawyers. So in 2020 and 2021, we supported 120 cases in various countries in Europe, and we assisted over 180 Palestinian rights advocates, which are activists, but also organizations, whether in Europe or in Palestine, and Palestinian NGOs facing various issues such as defunding. We defend also students, academics, journalists, and cultural institutions, and artists as well. And then we have an empower section where basically we research, we provide resources and promote strategic litigation against public and private actors who are involved in Israel's serious violations of human rights in Palestine. So, in the Netherlands, we have now 4 active cases that we are supporting. And the monitoring work that we have been doing in the past years led us to draw some patterns of repression or attempts to repress Palestinian rights advocates, and we published our finding in this report. So we based the research on 76 incidents that each of them were thoroughly analyzed. And the aim was to try to understand the silencing tactics in place, and also the main actors who are involved in the silencing. And then, of course, the idea was to try to understand better how this works, to better challenge the attacks, and then also prevent them from happening, of course. And we need, in order to do that, to also raise awareness among the large public here in the Netherlands and address the institutions, because, of course, they bear very important responsibilities in this issue that is quite problematic for Dutch democracy. So today I will not insist only on Israel lobbies, or what we called in the report Israel advocacy groups, but also I will try to expose the whole system that is behind that, and that sometimes allows those groups to achieve their goals and to get to the censorship. Because in the Netherlands, basically, those Israel advocacy groups are not so numerous compared to other countries, and alone they are not very powerful. But the fact that they are succeeding sometimes to silence criticism of Israel is actually because of the reaction or the inaction of what we named enabling third parties, who are often liberal institutions that intentionally or not intentionally or not, eventually allow restrictions of fundamental rights. But we get back to that a bit later. So the two main allegations that are used to delegitimize Palestinian rights advocacy in the Netherlands or anywhere are unfounded allegations of anti-Semitism or unfounded allegations of support to terrorism. And the main tactics that we have observed are first smear campaigns, and then we have, like most of the majority of our cases involve smear campaigns that aim to discredit individuals or groups. And then we had attempts at defunding civil society organizations and also the denying of use, denying the use of public and private space for activities, but also restrictions on academic freedom, and also threats with lawsuits, financial deplatforming as well, which is a set of actions that threatens or disrupts or completely ends the ability for individuals or groups to use financial platforms, including bank accounts, crowdfunding platform, etc. And also we observed, unfortunately, threats with violence, surveillance, and cyber attacks. So now the actors that are responsible for that are mainly well-known pro-Israel advocacy groups such as CD or Christians for Israel. We're talking about fundamental religious groups. And those groups basically replicate the propaganda that is issued by the Israeli government, whether the former Ministry of Strategic Affairs, or now other Israeli ministries, or also other publications of the famous NGO Monitor. And then we have the enabling actors. And here we have first conservative or far-right political parties such as FED, SRP, Christian Union, or PVV. And right-wing media, like the Telegraph, or very pro-Israel media like NIW. So basically, most of the time we see a chain of events happening. It's always the same pattern, and we see also a kind of coordination between those actors. And what happened is that we have a reporting from CD, for instance, and then we have amplification in the political sphere with parliamentary questions raised by those political parties most of the time, and then we have amplification in those media. And I want to illustrate that with a case that is included in the report. So Gate 48 is a group of Jewish and Israeli in the Netherlands. They organized an event on the Israeli security system. In 2016, it was at UvA here in Amsterdam. And so CD just asked the university board to prevent the event from happening, raising the university standards or the safety of Jewish or Israeli staff and students. And then a few days later, the SRP just asked parliamentary questions to the government. And then, then there were also like articles published in the media, but I missed that on my beautiful slide. But anyway, in the end, the Minister of Education just stood firm and defended academic freedom. And of course, the event happened as planned, but just to show this pattern, we observe it all the time, every event almost. And there was one event organized about Palestine and the ICC recently, organized by the Hague Humanity Hub, and exactly the same happened, basically. Reporting by CD, article in the media, and parliamentary question by also the PVV. So this is the mechanism in place, and apart from this very ideologically motivated actors, what is more concerning is when more liberal media or centrist political parties are becoming enabling actors. So here we have, for instance, Het Parool, or the Stentor as media, sorry for my very bad Dutch accent, or parties such as CDA or VVD. And also very concerning is when public institutions become enabling third parties, which can be for different reasons. First, maybe they are just uninformed, or they do not take the time to do appropriate fact-checking, or they face the pressure and the chilling effects, which is this fear to face backlash if they stand for Palestinian rights or if they disagree with Israel advocacy groups. And this fear also happens because of precedents of smears that were amplified in the media or in parliament. So this role of public institution is very concerning. It's not very developed in the report because it's something we have been observing more recently, especially in universities. Itai and Leila and Dina also have experienced that. But yeah, and another institutional actor to watch is the NCAB, who is the National Coordinator Against Antisemitism, who was appointed a few years ago. And we can consider him as a pro-Israel actor because of some statement that he made already, criticizing Palestine solidarity activism on campus, for instance, and also because he endorses and promotes the use of the IHR definition of antisemitism that we mentioned already. And this should be closely monitored because this definition and the examples that are attached to the definition conflates legitimate criticism of Israel with antisemitism. And the definition is being more and more implemented in Europe. And okay, so far the Dutch government has provided safeguards against the risk to affect freedom of expression and to prevent criticism of Israel. But we can expect to see the definition pushed more and more in the Netherlands, as it is the case in other countries in Europe. And yeah, because despite the fact that the IHR definition is supposed to be non-binding, that is not a source of primary legislation, the IHR definition has now turned into a soft law in some countries, not everywhere in Europe. But this soft law that is treated by public or private body as a de facto binding definition, which means that this has very concrete negative effects on the freedom of expression and freedom of assembly of individuals and groups. And at the LSE, we are dealing more and more with cases of repression of Palestinian rights advocacy that are involving the use of the IHR definition to smear and to sanction advocates, and especially in Germany, of course, as we mentioned, in the UK and Austria. So, about the impacts of this climate and those attempts to repress or successful repression of Palestinian rights advocacy, we have immediate impact that can be, inability to carry out activities as planned, distress, financial burden, drain of time, of resources, and most importantly, I mean, I don't say those impacts are not important, but there are long-term impact that can be intimidation and self-censorship. Also damage to reputation and an impact on the people's career. I'm just going to read a testimony from a scholar because in the Netherlands here, because I think it illustrates well the chilling effect I was mentioning before and also the role of institutions. So he said, as scholars, we often find that our battle is not against the people doing the actual intimidation, but against the institution who is supposed to defend us, but often does not. We rarely feel backed by the authorities, including our universities. What I want to convey is that this has led to self-censorship on a high level. This becomes even more problematic if one belongs to a minority group. So in the end, you want to organize academic activities that don't attract too much controversy. So this is the chilling effect. Okay, now this is a dark picture, but I also want to put things into perspective and stress that here in the Netherlands there is still a relatively broad civic space in which activists and organizations can organize events and and do things compared to countries like Germany. And also most of the cases and most of the attacks, for instance, that I mentioned in the report were eventually pushed back and were successful. Yeah, I will mention successful cases as well. But before going to the Netherlands, I just want to briefly tell you about a case in Germany. I think it's important to mention because first it can show you what could happen here if we are not being careful, but mostly to illustrate also that because through collective efforts, we can push back powerful actors and serious cases. Here it's surveillance and censorship, and even in countries where silencing is very important, such as Germany. So I'm going to stop talking for a few minutes, and so you can see what happened to Dr. Younes.
I'm Anna Esther Younes. I'm a German Palestinian scholar. I grew up in Berlin, on the east side, in fact, on the other side of the river, with the wall right at the end of my street. So for the past 10 years, I've been under attack by German media, but also private institutions for my academic and journalistic work relating anti-Semitism to anti-Muslim racism. It's particularly painful to see that I'm being surveilled for my journalism and my academic scholarship when my mother was already surveilled in the GDR. In 2019, I was disinvited from an event on anti-racism. And in the weeks following, I received a file that was leaked to me, which describes that I'm a supporter of anti-Semitism, Islamism, and sexism. And that file was the basis for my disinvitation from that event on anti-racism. The organization that collects this data is called RIAS. So what RIAS does is to gather a file about me with entirely distorted representations of my work, as well as my Facebook posts. This file was then sent to a politician in private, circulated behind my back, and within that political institution, getting me disinvited from the event on anti-racism on the ticket on the basis that I am the actual anti-Semite and supporter of Islamism and sexism, and hence should not partake. So some of the examples that are mentioned in the file is an article that I published in 2010 about the women's movement in Hamas, and merely working on that subject is already grounds enough to accuse me of supporting Hamas and of supporting sexism. Another example is a letter in support of Max Blumenthal and David Sheen by the German kind of Jewish Voice for Peace that wrote a letter in support, and I signed that as well. Or Professor Judith Butler is my supporter. That's apparently a bad thing. Knowing that there is a file about me has in many ways kind of supported what we already assumed, many of us. I mean, that there's the sense of being surveilled anyways, of being watched. But having the material proof in your hands actually can be seen as some kind of relief, but also some kind of proof for, the existence of your repression, because we also live in a state where people don't believe that this is possible again. I think we have come to a point in Germany where things are getting so polarized that more and more people understand that we are afraid of losing our jobs. We can't really freely speak in public. We're being surveilled. yeah, but on the other hand, I also see an increase in protest culture that wants to fight against that. So I guess for the future, we will need to continue talking so that maybe we can bring about change and increase the pressure. Yeah.
Okay, I'm cutting because I have 2 minutes left. But yeah, I mean, so Anna Younes, for nearly 2 years, she tried to get justice from the German authorities without success. And it's only after 2 years when she decided to file 2 lawsuits that we launched a public campaign with a letter supported by 500 academics and activists and organizations, and that we went to the media. Then finally things moved and she got her rights recognized. The case is not over yet, but it's a really good example of how litigation coupled with public pressure and also collective efforts and solidarity from civil society can achieve success. So Anna is also reclaiming her space and challenging Rias, which is, by the way, a super important actor when it comes to promoting the IHR definition at the European level, and this for years. So yeah, and also speaking out is the only way to break the pattern of repression. So that's why I just wanted to show you this video. But yeah, if I want to talk about one case in the Netherlands that was successful and that I really like, because basically DocP, which is the BDS group in the Netherlands, got a threat of lawsuit from the Israel Product Center that was mislabeling wines from the settlements, from the Israeli settlements, which is against the European law. And then they came to us and we came to a lawyer and they helped DocP go to the Dutch authorities and send some letters. And the outcome was really positive and empowering for DocP, because not only they were not sued in the end, but actually the Dutch authorities fined the IPC because they didn't respect the labeling rules. So that was a really good outcome, and it shows that yeah, it's possible to push back. You just need to come and ask for support. Yeah, then we have a case of defunding attempts to defund Al-Mizan Center for Human Rights, Palestinian human rights organization in Gaza. That was eventually unsuccessful because this time the government decided to not take into account all the unfounded allegations of support to terrorism and stood their ground because there was no evidence, as so many cases of attempts to defund Palestinian NGOs. But we don't have much time, so I will conclude. But basically, challenging Israeli advocacy groups is possible when you push back and ask for support. But of course, it drains a lot of resources and distracts the targeted people from doing the actual work and activism. And from a legal perspective, it's really concerning regarding fundamental rights to freedom of expression, academic freedom and freedom of assembly, which are rights protected by the Dutch Constitution and the European Convention on Human Rights. So, of course, the initial responsibility is on those Israel advocacy groups that trigger the repression, but eventually it's our authorities' responsibilities to protect our rights and to prevent those actors to silence our voices. And the Dutch government and also all public institutions, they have an obligation, positive obligations to protect fundamental rights and to also enable a favorable environment for sane debates to happen on such a topic as Israel-Palestine, which is of public interest. So, yeah, I will just conclude in recalling that the importance of collaborating and challenging collectively to push back against any ideologically motivated group that would attempt to silence us just because they don't agree with our political views and our fight for justice. And also, if you faced such attempts to repress your voice or to silence you, you can contact us. Here it is. And because we want to keep providing legal support for free, we also depend a bit on the people, on the public's generosity. So if you want to support us, you can also donate. Thank you so much.
So while the audience is thinking of the very good questions they will ask in a minute, can you explain very briefly what the IHRA definition is? Because not everyone might be familiar with it.
Yes, so the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, so Peter said what IHRA stands for, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. But the definition itself was not drafted by this organization, but that's a long story. But basically the definition is, I can read it to you. It's a very short sentence that defines anti-Semitism as a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Okay, this is the definition. Then there were examples that were attached to this definition and heavily promoted by Israel advocacy groups. And the problem is that a lot of those examples conflate legitimate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. For instance, there is one example that is saying, criticism of Israel, claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor is one of the examples. And basically this example is used to say that anyone who will say that Israel is an apartheid state is anti-Semitic, and we have seen that in many cases that we are supporting in the UK, for instance.
Okay, good enough. Thank you very much. So now I would like to open the floor for questions from the room, if we have any. We have one in the back. Yes.
Over the last few years, there have been reports by Amnesty International, B'Tselem, and Human Rights Watch about calling Israel an apartheid state. Do you think there is a way legally in Europe to get our governments to take those reports more seriously?
Thank you. And I think it's a very important question because it's a legal concept as well. Like the crime of apartheid is a legalistic term. So as a legal expert, I don't know if you are, what would you say?
I mean, it's easy to demonstrate that Israel is an apartheid state legally, but when it comes for the European states such as the Netherlands to recognize this, it's only political, unfortunately. And here there is a need for civil society to pressure more the government, pressure your MPs to go and ask for recognition of a fact. And that was demonstrated by so many Palestinian organizations before Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem. Let's go to our politicians, I would say.
Thank you. So litigation can help, but it's not the way, or politics.
We always say that the law is only a tool to achieve our political goals, so we also need activism.
Yeah. Thank you. Other questions from the room?
Thank you. I have a question about silencing, specifically in a Dutch context. I've been to a few events, and specifically of progressive Jewish civil society actors, and what they have done consistently in these events is kind of refuse to talk about Israel-Palestine, and they don't say that being against Israel in itself is anti-Semitic, but what they say is that asking this question to Jewish civil society actors, that in itself is anti-Semitic or racist. Would you call that silencing or not? How do you look at that? How would you contextualize that? Because I'm still kind of lost as to how to think about that new kind of more nuanced or different argument that they forward.
It's kind of like asking Muslims when an attack happens, are you with or against that attack as a Muslim in that sense?
Yeah, that's basically how they frame it. You could say.
Interesting.
Yeah, I would say it's part of the silencing and also this chilling effect that you are afraid of any backlash. I mean, I guess I could say also a few words on this, but
You can, I think, you can say who you're talking about, and I think I can guess. I think it starts with oi and ends in ve acts, right? Yeah. So there's I'm glad you noticed. Like, you phrased it really well. What exactly they're doing, and Dina, like what you said about the analogy between like, oh, don't ask Jews about Palestine. It's like an insult or a microaggression. Right? Like, it's almost like asking a Muslim, like, about, like, oh, you know, a terrorist attack happens. What do you think? What's your position? Or, I don't know. Do you know anyone in no, but jokes aside, I think you're very right to ask, is this also part of the discourse of silencing, right? Let's see. I would say that in a way it's a very cynical use of the language of diversity policy that has developed in the last years and has sort of entered or you know, fucking the anti-racist movement has been pushing for anti-racist policy for ages and ages and ages and ages. Now we have something called diversity policy, which is its own hellscape in a way to navigate, because apparently we like to put like white, brown, and black people on pictures together, but really diversifying curriculums or teacher positions, firing some white teachers, and like maybe opening your job applications a little more accessibly isn't something we want to do yet. But now there's even a more cynical use here where one group goes like, hey, we're now in society, we're able to sort of talk about microaggressions based on race or your identity, right? Like someone on a panel in Pakhuis de Zwijger during the Week Against Racism said that asking like Jews about Palestine is a microaggression. And when I see a Palestinian flag at a climate march, she said this in the most posh Amsterdam accent imaginable. She said, that's a triggering thing to me, right? We're now able to use those words like triggering and microaggression as indicating some form of interpersonal violence. And then it's fucking used against one of the most important parts of the anti-racist movements. And that's radically cynical and really what I would call it solidarity busting. Like a form of union busting, but against the solidarity movement. It's even more aggressive than silencing, I would say. But you can see the emotional attachment to this issue. But thank you a million for your question.
Thank you. One last question. Do we have it? Yes.
Well, I do have a question about the enabling environment or factors that you talked about in your report as well. What I did not see here, which in my opinion is very important when we analyze the situation in the Netherlands, is the silence and blindness of the mainstream government coalition and the reasons behind that. There are also other reasons, in my opinion, than the pressure by the Israel lobbies and or all the media and organizations you mentioned, and that is the entangled also economic interest and all these relations, defense relations, exchange of technology with the police, for example, and so on and so forth, which makes it very priceful for the Dutch government to take stands that are meaningful when it comes to the abuse of Palestinians by the Israeli authorities, isn't it?
Absolutely. When it comes to the reason why the Dutch government or other European governments would be so reluctant to yeah, to get Israel accountable for their human rights violations or war crimes is definitely the cooperation they have built for years and years with Israel, and especially economic, security, academic. I mean, the cooperation between the EU and Israel is huge, and of course there will be a price to pay, like a real price. I'm talking about money, of course, and but there are many other different reasons. I think there are also historical reasons, and yeah, no, you're right.
So silence is also enabling, actually, the silencing. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Alice. We will move on to our last set of speakers. I will ask Itai van der Wal and Leila Katterman to go and stand there. Itai and Leila are both university students who are active in the Palestine Solidarity student movement in The Hague and Utrecht. They're also part of the network of students and scholars who initiated and worked with the Rights Forum on the Freedom of Information request, which they will also discuss. Go ahead.
Calling.
Yeah, you should get it up.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes. Calling Israel an apartheid regime was a slowly creeping trend for a very long time, and in 2022, it will be a real threat. These are the words of the Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid earlier this year in January. And he was right. Last year's development in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the international solidarity with the Palestinian people made it increasingly difficult for Israeli officials to justify their apartheid practices on the ground. Example of Ben & Jerry's. Apparently that ice cream is anti-Semitic now.
Not anymore.
Yeah, they reversed that decision yesterday, but well. In 2021, Israeli NGO B'Tselem published a detailed apartheid report, as was mentioned earlier, and it was also backed by the Human Rights Watch and several other organizations and the latest Harvard Law School. In March of this year, students all across the world and in the Netherlands were frustrated by the mainstream news narrative that showed the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Also, that word is already a problem. As a complicated, irrational religious dispute instead of the world's last goddamn settler colonial project. I will talk first about a silencing case in Leiden University, which was during this Israeli Apartheid Week that happened in March. So Students for Palestine, which is a collective of students active in The Hague, wanted to organize a panel discussion with Dina as our moderator, titled Apartheid, Racism and Intersectionality. And that event was quite an example of a silencing case. I will quickly kind of tell you the course of events so that you see how this silencing takes place, because of course, the silencing is never direct, especially in a university that has Praesidium Libertatis, or Bastion for Freedom, on their logo. So the course of events was as follows. First, we were being unreasonably policed while trying to book a room. The professors trying to book it on our behalf were called into the security office several times. And of course, when you prepare an academic event, this stresses the fact that of the organization, because you don't know when you're going to have the room, how you can contact the speakers, and all of these things that usually should be given by a university to their students. Then they asked us to change our moderator without giving any reason for it. Obviously, we refused to change a moderator because they did not have any argument of how she does not constitute to the good share requirement that is in the house rules of the university. Once we announced the panel on Instagram, which was 5 days before, even though we were trying to get the room a month before, with the announcement of room to be announced, since we couldn't wait more. We wanted people to come, of course. The organizers, us as students, were called into the security office without our fellow professors. Students for Palestine sent an email to the university saying that we feel uncomfortable with meeting the security officer without our professors, not only due to power asymmetry, but also due to the fact that we had bad experiences with him as individuals before, and that there was significant proof that he is active with the Israeli lobby. And this is one thing that's very present at universities. The Israeli lobbies, they have their people there, and even if they don't, they have their connections to the administration of universities, and that's how they influence the universities, which bow to the Israeli lobbies all the time, in the Netherlands and beyond. So after that, we were not allowed to have the room. The panel was cancelled. Several professors stood up. There was a petition made which got hundreds of signatures, upon which then the university decided to give us a room. But then, a day later, that decision was overruled again by the executive board of the university, because we still refused to change our moderator. To add the cherry on top, the university then proposed to organize a symposium and invite us to debate about apartheid, because apparently discussing apartheid is not an academic topic. The requirement of a neutral chair is a very constant silencing strategy, which is a strategy of requiring neutrality. And of course, this requires a neutral position on Palestine. As if the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I really don't like to call it conflict, because that's already the start of the problem. It's as if the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is then a problem between two people that don't like each other, instead of an unequal settler colonial state upon which the Palestinians want to defend themselves from. Of course, this follows double standards. With the war in Ukraine, we really could realize how not only is boycotting and divestments and sanctions the normal way of dealing with a state that doesn't respect international law and the sovereignty of another state, but also how resistance, whether it's through Molotov or protests or any of that, is a very honorable resistance. It's an honorable cause and an honorable duty that not only the people on the ground have, but all the people internationally. A professor of our university, in response to the drama that was created around the silencing case, tweeted, and I quote, "As one of those who has organized events in response to Russia's aggression versus Ukraine, I can say there was no obstacle placed in my way, no questions asked about chair or panelists." As you can see, Palestine, the topic of Palestine on campuses and elsewhere is put on a different standard. It is treated as a security issue, which of course, in essence, then is racist. It is the criminalization of opposition. On anti-Semitism, though they did not claim that we were anti-Semitic, and of course they had no basis to claim that, during the meeting with our rector, there was the claim made that the panel was initially cancelled this fast and without really looking around it because a group of students felt unsafe. Of course, that group of students is a group of students we well know, and they also have opposition from the other Jewish students, because the Zionist students and the Jewish students as well, they don't agree on matters of Palestine in a lot of ways, but they are thought to do so by the administration of the university. Of course, when we speak about our unsafety threats, whether they're physical or digital at campus, and when we complain about them to the security office or administration or professors, they are never handled. This suggests that the university holds Jewish safety at the expense of Palestinian exclusion. And of course, since they cannot tell us what and what not to speak about directly, they do so, they oppress us and they silence us through structural means. So they will deny us space. They will kind of try to tell us to change our moderator. And they will use the house rules against us. They used 3 house rules against us, said that we broke them and didn't follow them, although we did. So Article 8A. Organizers of an event are members of the university society. Students, employees, and in exceptional cases, alumni of the university. Needless to say, the people trying to book the room were professors, and they made it very clear that we're students. And we did not refuse to meet with the security office, we just refused to meet without the professors. Article 8B. Regarding the content, there is a real connection between an event and the primary tasks of the university, namely education, research, and valorization of societal outreach. So of course, here's the question. This conflict has been going on for over 70 years. And then at universities, they don't want us to speak about it. They want us to have a neutral position about it. This is just like maintaining the status quo, even in the young minds of people that are supposed to change it tomorrow. And then Article D. There's always room for a debate, for which, if necessary, a good moderator is provided. So apparently, the security office thought that a Palestinian woman cannot be a good moderator and that this topic is too sensitive and emotional for her to chair. And that apartheid is a topic to debate. Clearly just ignoring all of these reports that they base their values and quote their lectures on. It is important to note that what happened in Leiden is not an isolated incident. The silencing campaign by Israeli advocacy groups at universities, hand in hand with the university administrations and authorities, has included banning the words Israeli Apartheid Week, or naming or calling it a week, or Israeli apartheid in general, as it was the case in Maastricht. Not allowing students to hang up informative pro-Palestine, anti-occupation, or anti-apartheid posters on campus, which is the case in almost all universities. Excluding Palestine from course syllabuses, especially in courses such as international relations, global history, in which Israeli-Palestinian conflict is apparently not a topic to discuss. Of course, the denial of spaces and shutting down political spaces. The rector of our university answered to the protest that students had, with one of her main arguments being the university is not a political platform. Note that this was the Faculty of Humanities, Global Affairs, International Relations, and so on. And of course, the illegal withholding of information of the university's complicity with apartheid.
Which is the transition we built to the part about the Freedom of Information request, which you may or may not have heard about. So that's what I'll speak about a little bit today, right now. So let me take you back in time a little bit, and I'll go by how this started. First of all, what happened, how it started, why it was done, and what went wrong, and what's going great. All in 10 minutes. All in 10 minutes. So basically what we saw in 2021, May of 2021, with Israel's onslaught on Gaza, its horrific bombing of Gaza and suppression of Palestinian protest in the West Bank, in Israel proper, and international outrage. Oh, let's not forget forced evictions in Sheikh Jarrah and Silvan, and many, many more incidents that somehow all packed into 1 month, well, that looked like they were packed in 1 month, May and June 2021, in terms of media coverage. But what happened which has extended beyond those months, is like the international solidarity movement received a received a shock, and especially in the Netherlands, we saw massive mobilization, especially on, well, of course, across the board, on the streets, neighborhoods, community centers, but also at universities. We saw a massive mobilization in solidarity with Palestine. So what came out of this was, well, what happened first of all was that a statement was accepted by the Gender Studies Department in Utrecht, at Utrecht University, proclaiming solidarity with the Palestinian people. This was a department proclaiming that, an entire department, which was subsequently signed by many art departments, other departments at universities internationally in the Netherlands. On top of that, 600 academics signed a declaration of solidarity and a commitment to boycott and a call to boycott solidarity for Palestine, and commitment and call to boycott Israel. And out of that grew all of a sudden a movement that had been, dare I say, a little dormant in the Netherlands over the past few years, the Palestinian Solidarity Student Movement and scholarly movement. So basically, a couple months on at the start of the new academic year in 2021, 2022, this movement was starting to increasingly organize itself. And what it noticed was that the movement, and I'm going to say we because we're part of that movement, we noticed we have knowledge of universities' ties with Israel, and we have knowledge even of military application of some research projects that universities do, but we don't have it systematized. We're not sure whether we know everything. We don't know why or how the university engages in these projects. Does the university consider the impacts of its projects that it runs with Israeli universities and companies, etc.? And we also noticed that many of our events and just speech acts were getting suppressed or were at risk of suppression and repression at universities and on social media. So we also wanted to know how that works. So more or less at the same time, from several people in the movement, the idea came up to make use of the Dutch Freedom of Information Act, which is similar to many Freedom of Information Acts around the world. Basically, it gives citizens the right to requisition documents from public bodies and very wide mandate to requisition and publicize documents from public bodies, policy documents, communications, really anything. So this was the issue. These were the means at our disposal, and we saw an opportunity to make to write a freedom of information request, so that information that we needed became public, became systematic, and we had hard evidence to prove ties to Israeli apartheid, and we had hard evidence on the basis of which to hold our universities accountable for their working with a state and sometimes complicity in human rights offenses, systematic human rights offenses, no less. So we also saw examples of this being done. For example, before the movement started writing this freedom of information request, many scholars were sent a very similar freedom of information request about their ties to China, basically China as a whole, Chinese universities, Chinese companies. And even this request went really far in that it even asked for personal ties, not just institutional ties. This is, out of this research effort, I'm not sure whether it's a freedom of information request, the Free University of Amsterdam, the Vrije Universiteit, had, basically, it was found out that a human rights center there was funded with Chinese government money, and it was disbanded, and the money refunded. We also noticed that against the Rights Forum in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, a freedom of information request was filed with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, asking for all the communications between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Rights Forum, which is a Dutch NGO that speaks out against Israeli occupation. So we knew that you could ask about ties to foreign powers, which are involved in human rights abuses. We knew that you could ask about NGOs that support or that speak out about Israel-Palestine. We started writing this request. When I say we, I'm really speaking about the movement. The two of us are just two people that are part of the movement. We're involved, but by no means are we the authors of the Freedom of Information request. The Freedom of Information request was a collective effort, the authors of which we can't pinpoint. So basically, Dina, how much time have I got? Amazing. So what we wanted information on was exchange with Israeli universities. We wanted information on research with Israeli companies and universities. We wanted information about policies that universities have when they engage in these relationships. Do they check for human rights abuses? Do they speak about Palestine at all? And we wanted information on how silencing proceeds. So we approached the Rights Forum because we started to notice that filing this might be inadvisable on personal on the names of or under the personal names of members of the movement. The Rights Forum agreed to help us with this. They did not question our motives. In fact, they principally stood by us in using a democratic means that is at the disposal of any Dutch citizen, and they were really they were angry at not with us, but they were angry at the fact that we were or that Dutch citizens or citizens in general had to be afraid to use a democratically legitimate means. So the information requests were filed. A massive backlash happened. Basically, the information requests, which should remain confidential until they are until they're completely wrapped, were leaked within weeks, 10 days, I believe. Universities had very sloppily handled the request itself, sending out Excel sheets where they asked most of their staff members to fill out their ties with Jewish organizations, which is a word that is not mentioned at all in the Freedom of Information request itself. And basically the university's sloppiness, their refusal to talk to the Rights Forum in the early days of the smear campaign led to an incredible amount of hatred, an incredible amount of incitement, politicians calling for the entire Freedom of Information request to be thrown out by universities, et cetera, parliamentary questions, several parliamentary questions being filed, most by right-wing movements alleging anti-Semitism and ties to terrorism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the important part is that the universities are disclosing, almost all universities, except for some because of technical details, almost all universities are disclosing, are recognizing our right to ask for their ties with Israeli universities and with Israeli companies. And we're seeing the first documents coming in. We're already starting to do research. However, the universities have also, in response to the smear campaigns held against the Rights Forum, refused to disclose their communications and ties, their institutional communications and ties, not individual, with Zionist lobby organizations. And they've also refused, and this is the weird part, well, that whole part's the weird part, but this is something that we still have to wrap our head around. They're also refusing to disclose the policies the internal policies that relate to engaging in relationships with Israel and whether they check for human rights offenses, which leads us to believe there probably aren't any and they're very ashamed, or writing them right now. They better be. So basically, just skipping, this is the part where you click on the remote to skip to the end of the episode. What we've noticed is that the silencing campaign and restrictions on academic freedom exemplify basically the neoliberalization of education, where universities basically serve economic goals. Because what this comes down to is defending the apparatus that is in place in order to shield Israel's knowledge economy. Israel's a knowledge economy. It floats on an IT bubble. It floats on defense development. It floats on arms trade. So this is something that we've noticed and can already conclude. And I'll close down this bit by saying that we're now in a position where we can start to hold our universities to account for their ties to Israeli apartheid and its settler colonialism and its systematic human rights offenses. But there is a lot more work to be done and minds to be changed to reveal how silencing is systematic and how it can and must be opposed. What you can do right now is donate to the ELSC and to the Rights Forum to help us in this fight, and keep an eye out for when we, well, we'll get back to you, basically. Can you say any more?
So thank you for that, for those two very lively examples of silencing attempts. So we're going to open the floor for questions. We also have in our audience Gerard Jonkman, who is the director of the Human Rights Forum, who was involved in this Freedom of Information Act. So you can also direct questions to him. And the floor is yours. Take your time. We have 12 minutes to go. Yes. 1 second.
Since I've never studied in Holland, so I would like you to clarify, when it comes to studies of international relations at Leiden, such a school, this subject, how it's taught. I don't know, like, as students, how can you clarify? What's your experience? And we have here someone here. So I don't know to what extent, there is censorship. So I'm curious. I have my kids now at schools, and I can see, too much focus on one element of history, but there is an exclusion of the other. So please educate me.
Yeah, so you're two students who are studying two different subjects at different universities. Is it being taught? Is it being mentioned also in other studies that you know of?
Well, I must admit I was very disappointed to realize that when I was starting my studies in international studies and I was talking to people that study international studies, international relations, that they don't know anything about Palestine. Zero. And especially also people, who wrap their head about post-colonial studies and who talk about how horrible colonialism was an occupation. It still doesn't cross their mind that Palestine is a factor there and that you can't talk about post-coloniality yet. And in that sense, I think the exclusion of Palestine is definitely not accidental, because the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is not. Well, they can excuse it by saying it's regional, right? They can say, yeah, we're going to focus on Europe because we are in Europe. However, the fact that, I was just flying here this morning from Italy, and you can see that you have the rest of, you have Europe, and then you have the rest of the world, and then you have USA, Israel. So already Israel is put in a different standard. It's put alongside the US in a lot of ways. But when we talk about international relations and how the US foreign policy influences, let's say, Europe, the Middle East, or Africa, Israel is never a factor. It's, in fact, actually not mentioned. Whereas we talk about all the, conflicts that are around. We talk about Russia, of course. We talk about China. We talk about even the border disputes of the refugees, but Palestine, Israel is just not talked about. And I think there's a big purpose in that. And I really think that today we have a really big culture shift at campuses in which they don't want us to be political. They don't want us to be activists. They don't want us to challenge the university. In a way, they don't want us in the age of capitalism to become Derridas or Davises. They want us to become Mark Zuckerbergs and Elon Musks. And in that sense, yeah, as Isa was saying, the neoliberalization of education is really, in a way, stands for the fact that we should not go into this cultural exceptionalism that is Israel. We should not challenge that cultural exceptionalism.
Thank you. Well, I just want to give Itai, if you want to add on that.
I think what we're seeing right now is that the student movement is doing most of the education. It's like it's self-education, I guess. But also like credit is due where credit is due. There are some academics, 600 academics really put themselves out there signing a petition in solidarity, name and surname, petition of solidarity and boycott. But they're also doing the educational work, right? And that's also putting yourself out there and contributing to like a genuine decolonial dialogue at universities is, yeah, that's what they're doing, but also the student movement is bearing much of that load.
Just thank you. With the microphone, the follow-up you need to speak in the microphone. We'll give her one follow-up question very briefly.
What makes you exposed? Giving the fact that you are not coming from I see you are Dutch, but is it the social media here? What makes the young generation now exposed to this?
Yeah. So what makes non-Palestinians in the Netherlands exposed to Palestine?
I mean, I'm half Palestinian, so I'm really biased.
For example,
I mean, I think I think that the Netherlands is so in universities, many second and third generation children of second and third generation immigrants are entering universities, which many people are not happy about, including the rector of Utrecht University, but let's talk about that another time. No, this guy literally came out and said, like, oh, there's a lot of people at university who don't belong here, coming here these days. And you can tell he's talking about working class and like the children of immigrants. But these people have been raised with parents who teach them. They've been raised with different sources of media and with consciousness, right? Consciousness that they're not necessarily welcome guests in the Netherlands, and that such a thing as institutional racism exists, and that ethnic profiling exists. And those people are coming into universities these days. Also, many international students arrive. Maybe not the German ones, but some Germans actually come here to escape. But many international students are raising awareness. Also, a special mention needs to be made of many queer people of color recognizing, especially in intersectional struggles. So that's how consciousness grows as people. And sure, the social media and the panels that we do, and the Zionists going on rants and silencing campaigns, just raising awareness, really.
Right. So I think we have 2 more questions. Paul here, and I saw a hand in the back. And then, yes. And then we'll leave it with that. Okay? Yes.
Yes, I have to defend the Universiteit van Amsterdam in that respect. I was teaching for more than 30 years international relations. And I have been teaching courses on Palestine quite often. So that's one. Since what I have done, okay, you were kidding. Thank you. And since I left, I hear from several colleagues that they are teaching courses constantly on Palestine. Within conflict studies, for instance, I know Martijn Dekker teaches on Palestine, and there are many more at anthropology, where Dina did her PhD. So maybe the UvA is an exception, which I doubt, honestly speaking.
I think it also depends on the discipline, maybe. So, in international relations, it might not seem as relevant as in conflict studies. So, it might be a study worth a study to study where it is studied, if that makes sense. Okay, so we'll go to the gentleman first, and then we'll have room for one more.
Well, my question is more focused on the silencing part. So there is more than one ways of silencing. There is several, but two things that I want to discuss or I want to ask about is how to battle the ways of people so the Israeli lobby emotionally blackmails people, for example, like saying, like she already mentioned before, you cannot tell a Jew discuss the Palestinian-Israeli conflict with a Jew. Also, something they usually use is the misuse of language or interpretation or misleading definitions. For example, the word anti-Semite in itself can be interpreted in many different ways. For example, if you go back to the origin of Semites, Palestinians themselves can be considered Semites. So the word is misinterpreted and misused in different ways. So how can we battle these? So how we can battle using emotional tactics to silence. Emotional tactics to silence and the misuse or the misinterpretation of language.
No. Thank you. I would think one of you can answer. You decide.
Or Alice.
Or Alice.
Yeah, I mean, well, we can legally challenge them if we can, but I will say we should mostly reclaim our space and the narrative and
reclaim. So also reclaim terminology and language and correct them. Yes.
And I would just add to that all these silencing campaigns and all of these smear campaigns, what they want to do is to silence you, of course. They want you to defend yourself instead of attacking them. Attacking Israeli occupation and apartheid. So I think as much as it is important to defend oneself, it is even more important to state why you are saying these things that they are smearing you about in the first place, and to reinstate the importance of that. Because in the end, all of the things that these advocacy groups do is a distraction mechanism that they use on you to distract you from what you're actually working towards.
Yes, because you will notice where they don't really engage with the argument itself, but they use smear campaigns to try to get them back to the core of what you're talking about. Very good point. The final question. Yeah.
I think it's not really relevant. I just wanted to say...
1 second, wait for the microphone. Yes,
it's
really
not substantively that relevant, I think, but I just wanted to say that I study at Amsterdam University College, for the woman who asked about where to send her kids to. And I feel in my college that the Palestine question indeed can be discussed, and also at UvA. I feel like there's definitely an open space, so I think it's very... university and culture, the culture of the university really determines how these matters are dealt. So, yeah. That's what
Thank you. Then Itai, did you still want to say something?
Yeah, I think really quickly in response to Mohammed, I know you. I think one thing that we should mention is we've talked a bit about the IHRA definition, and it's really hard to tell how it's being institutionalized in the Netherlands at the moment. But we've seen it come up, for example, in the Freedom of Information request in response to parliamentary questions asked, asking the government, do you consider this anti-Semitic? And the government said, had a very, very well thought out answer that pleased neither side, but diplomatic is what we call that. The answer was basically the Rights Forum has the right to use these democratically legitimate means to requisition information. At the same time, we can use the IHRA definition to tell what qualifies as anti-Semitism or not. So I think in the Netherlands, maybe we are in a position where we can still fight the IHRA before it takes hold, as it has done in, dare I say, the UK and Germany. Just look into how Jeremy Corbyn's campaign was basically busted using the IHRA definition, but we have a chance to fight it before it takes hold, before it takes root. So also, I would say, in response to your point about language, fighting attempts to define something like anti-Semitism where there is much disagreement, and also define it as something separate from racism. Right? I think that's also really important.
So thank you, everyone. I'm sorry for the last hands, but we will remain here maybe to chat afterwards if you still want to really get something on. Thank you, everyone. So To bring this event to a close, I now give the floor for the final minute of today to Jaap Hamburg, who is the chair of A Different Jewish Voice and one of the organizers of today, to close the event.
I have the most pleasant task of the evening to say thanks to everybody. Sorry, I have the most pleasant task of the evening to say thanks to everybody who contributed to the panel. First of all, Dina, we would like to express our thanks. That means the Vulture Stichting and A Different Jewish Voice by handing you a little present.
Nice. Presents are always nice.
Yes.
They're always welcome. Thank you.
And I would like to add that Leiden University made a very big mistake in refusing you as a moderator.
I know I'm great as a moderator.
Second, of course, Alice, what you, in all your modesty, didn't mention was that you were highly instrumental in making the report of the European Legal Support Center, the report that is over there in black and white. The original is in color, but we have done it in black and white because it's in a way a black and white matter that is described in the report. So thanks a lot, Alice, not only for the report, but also for your contribution tonight. Laila, you expect probably that you will get a present as well? No, you didn't? Well, then I would hope. Thanks a lot for your outspoken and very clear voice, and for coming here from Italy to tell us about your experience. And if I may add a personal note, I hope you will be very successful in exposing all this injustice. So, Itai, what I said to Laila holds especially for you. Working at Utrecht University as a legal master's student and showing lots of courage in exposing what is wrong in your eyes, being educated in Israel. You're an example for how a Jewish experience can be used the other way around, not supporting Israel, but in criticizing it. Thank you for that. Those of you who can see that I have one more in my hand, will wonder, for whom is that? It's not for me, it's not even for Fadi, it's for somebody in the public. What you should know is that the Rights Forum, I happen to be a member of the board of the Rights Forum, but I know from very nearby that the work the Rights Forum has to do and the smear campaign that it has experienced by putting forward this freedom of information request was unbelievable. We have at the Rights Forum website some of the smears that were put in letters and in Twitter to them, and you don't believe your eyes. If you want to see how people try to impress and to silence you, well, I would really advise you look at the website of the Rights Forum. Now, the director of the Rights Forum is here, and he personally got the brunt of all this, and he has half of his time a week is now done for the Freedom of Information Act request. He was very modest in the public. We want to hand him the same present as we did to you, because his work in the background is of utmost importance concerning the Freedom of Information Act. So Gerard, this one is for you.
Yes?
Dina, I leave the final words for you because I guess there is a possibility to have a drink downstairs, but I'm not quite
Yes,
sure.
so thank you. So you see the perks of being here physical and not online, that we get gifts, and Peter Weiner didn't get one. So I'm lucky we were here today physically together, all of us, and I hope we have a lot of stuff to think about and new arguments to use in the future when we get into a heated discussion or a silencing attempt. So there is, we can still have drinks downstairs, we can still have chit-chats together, so let's move this downstairs.
Don't forget to take, sorry.
And don't forget to take the reports and the articles.
An article by Peter Weiner
Yes.
about his recent experience in Germany.
And have a good evening. Thank you, everyone.